attendees. So we're going to do Okay, hello everyone. It is 10 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Lauren Antone, and I'm the Senior Marketing and Events Coordinator at MAR, as well as the producer of our free webinar series. Our webinar today is called Selling with Style. This webinar will cover how to identify your clients and your own behavioral styles and incorporating strategies to help you close more deals. After our live session, the webinar will be recorded and added to our website at marealtor.com. If you have any questions throughout the session, please type them in the bottom of the chat box on your screen and I will hold a Q&A afterward. Our presenter today is Paula Kowalczyk. Paula Kowalczyk has been in real estate for 20 years. She started her career as a National Rookie of the Year for ERA, selling over $10 million in her first year. She went on to build a team that was consistently recognized at the top 2% of the market, selling over $30 million a year. She has her Graduate Realtor Institute designation, her Certified Real Estate Brokerage Manager designation, and is a Massachusetts licensed real estate instructor. After getting her MBA 5 years ago, Paula was a Director of Training and Coaching before joining Berkshire Hathaway Home Services Commonwealth as a sales manager, trainer, and coach. Over these last 5 years, her coaching and training has turned many agents into top sales performers. Now, over to Paula.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Sales by Selling with Style. What we're going to take a look at today is talk about your own behavioral style, what that is, what does that even mean, and take a look at how you can figure out what your behavioral style is if you don't yet know that. And we're going to take a look at how to identify the style of your clients so that you can recognize how they're showing up in the transactions and in your interactions with them. And lastly, we'll take a look at the strategies for how do you adjust your style to your client styles to help increase your sales. Sound like a great plan today? So we're going to look at converting more of those leads and opportunities into sales. It's very important as a realtor, I know many of you have probably recognized this in your long careers, that we have sales skills, and that's important to come to the table with, but our people skills can be even more important to help those deals move along the track and to actually get to the closing table. So let's take a look at the objectives real quick, which you just talked about. What are the 4 behavioral styles? What's your primary, and secondary behavioral styles? How are we going to identify the behavioral style of your clients? And what strategies can you implement to help you get more sales? So what is behavioral style? Our behavioral style actually helps determine how we think, how we make decisions, how we communicate with folks, how we manage our own time, and how we show up in stress and conflict. A lot of folks have heard of the DISC assessment. That's one way. Another way, which is one of the ones I'm going to use today, is called the people grid. It's a people style grid. So they all tie in, and I'll use the DISC assessment values as well, so that if for those of you that are familiar with that, can relate to what we're talking about on these behavioral styles. So we have a primary and a default style. Now I want to clarify something as you take a look at this. You want to be really careful not to approach this from what you would like to be or what you think you would want to be, but more, how do you show up in different situations? And today's focus is really going to be on how you show up in a business transaction. How do you show up in the real estate transaction or for the deal? How do you show up for your clients? And what is that natural primary and secondary style that is the most comfortable for you? And we are going to talk today about adapting your style to your clients, but first we want to really understand what's your natural style, what's your default and your go-to in the process, so that we can understand how that's going to come across to the clients. I know a lot of us, and I've had deals the same way, where we don't feel like we mesh with the client, right? Or we feel like we're constantly fighting, or we wish they would just look at things the way we're looking at things. That's usually an indication that your styles aren't aligned. Doesn't mean you can't do the deal, doesn't mean you can't help them in the process. It just means you're going to have to adapt and understand where they're coming from. And then we go into that deal with folks that are just like us, they're the same style, and it's like magic, right? Everything flows. They seem to understand everything we're saying to them. And so it makes the deal just that much easier to go through. So it really helps we're going to look at it today from the business side, but this actually incorporates into your life and into your relationships, into your families, really anybody that you're interacting with out there. Why is it important to know your style and take a look at this, and why are we looking at this today? Well, because if we don't understand how we're showing up to a situation and how the other person might be showing up to a situation, it can be hard to build rapport and connect with someone. In real estate, one of the best tools or assets we have is being able to build trust with that client, so that they know, we're helping them through the transaction, we understand what their concerns are, and we are going to help them get that home of their dreams or get out of that home of their dreams. So understanding the behavioral style will help you build better rapport. It allows you to become a little more persuasive and influential in the process, so that there is that trust and understanding of how you're trying to help them. It can avoid miscommunication. If we're not communicating with someone in the correct style, and we've all had this happen where we've sent an email or a text message and the client or someone else takes that the wrong way, sometimes that's just a misinterpretation based on style. We didn't mean it that way, or we weren't trying to relay that message, but it gets misunderstood because of the way they approach that communication. And it also can help you avoid offending and or rubbing someone the wrong way, right? We all know that in real estate, we're not trying to be salesy. We're just trying to help people make that transition in or out of a home. And doing that from your own natural style and meeting them where they're at can make that a seamless and easier transaction all around. So let's dive in and take a look at what the 4 styles are. And I have included in here in the blue the DISC version of this as well. Again, many of you have probably been familiar with the DISC assessment or heard that term. If you're curious, I'm a very high I or expressive, and a D, which is the driver piece. And what happens with our personality styles, depending on the situation, one might come in a little bit stronger than the other, where we need to adjust and show up. So let's take a look at what this chart's telling us. This is actually showing us that there's 2 grids here. One is either less responsive or more responsive. And on the less responsive side, we have the analytical and the drivers. On the more responsive side, we have the amiables and the expressives. The other part of the grid goes into assertiveness, sort of control, or how someone shows up into that communication or into that experience. On the less assertive side, you have the analyticals and the amiables, and on the more assertive side, you have the drivers and the expressives. So let's start to drive in and talk about your behavioral side, or help you have the tools to give you the tools to help you figure out what your behavioral type is. Now, you have the handout in the documents.
Yes, it's under the handouts tab. If you go ahead and click that arrow down, then you can have access to any of the handouts that we have here.
And I'll apologize because I forgot to number the pages for you, but the first page of that handout is the behavioral analysis questionnaire. And the way you'd fill that out is you want to take this questionnaire from your, in a business mode, from your business behavior, and you want to not overthink it. You need to go with your first instinct on these answers, because typically what happens when we overthink is we start to drive into what we think we want to be, or who we think we should be, and not who we really are in our primary and secondary behaviors. You're going to fill out both the letter side on the left and the number sign on the right for each of the lines. And again, this is something you can do after. This is also recorded, so you can always go back through this to take notes through this. But you're going to pick out on the first line A to D. Are you more forceful or are you more easygoing? And where would you find out? Where would you think you land on that range? Next one, active, passive, A to D. That's how you're going to go through and circle just one on each side of the chart. Once you do that, you're going to add up at the bottom. How many D's did you circle? How many C's? How many B's? How many A's? And then to the right, how many 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s? You're going to have two values that comes out of that. And the two values are going to give you one number and one letter. Okay, and that, so let's say you're an A3. If you go to the next page on page 2 in the handout, that's going to help you chart what you actually are. So if you look at the chart, each grid, if you will, and I'll go back to the grid we had here, each grid has another grid within it that helps identify your secondary. So as I identified to you, I'm a expressive first with the driver. So if you look at the boxes on the top and the left, if I said, what did I say, A3 for the first one? So an A3 falls in an expressive driver, which is actually what I am. I actually picked that randomly, see, and I ended up right where I was. That gives you your primary and your secondary type. So if you were a C2, you would be an analytical expressive. So this helps identify your two primary default styles. How do you show up in situations? More importantly, how do you show up under stress when you're not overthinking things? What's your sort of natural style that's going to show up? And I do want to stress here, because sometimes folks will say, oh, I don't want to be that style. Actually, they're all really important in the world of business and in communication, and there's no right or wrong here. It is just understanding what's your natural default style, what do you go to, and what do the clients go to, so that you can meet them where they're at. So now, once you've identified what style you are, let's talk a little bit about what the different styles mean or behavioral types mean. Start with the analyticals. The analyticals are sort of what it sounds like, very analyzing. They like data. They want a lot of facts and figures. They're okay working alone. They tend to like a lot of detail in the situation. They're very conscientious. They're usually extremely calm and thoughtful in a crisis. And they're also going to be typically very disciplined with their time. So they're going to, they're going to want to know what the data is. They're going to want to know, what are the facts that are going to help me make this decision? On the weakness side, they can be indecisive. The need to have all the data and the facts and the figures can actually make it really difficult sometimes for an analytical to make a decision. They can be they can procrastinate. My favorite term is called analysis paralysis when I've worked with some of these clients, because they tend to get into such a mode of wanting to overanalyze. They want so much data, and then they tend to bog themselves down because it's hard to make a decision because they have too much data to then move forward. They don't typically like to take risks, so they're not going to be looking for high risk situations. They don't really like change, so they don't typically transition really easily, and they tend to look at the downside. Now, if you were trying to evaluate your clients, your prospective clients, or your buyers or your sellers, some of the clues you can look for, and you can see on the bottom here, I've got what we call R: appearance, rate of speed, and eye contact. There's actually a chart in the last page of your handout as well that will help identify these separately. But typically an analytical is going to be very conservative, very practical. They usually speak a little slow, more deliberate. And from an eye contact standpoint, they tend to look down a lot. It's not as frequent eye contact. So you can tend to find, an analytical tends to be deep in thought. So they're thinking about their own thoughts, which is why they won't look at you to make the eye contact, to make that connection. Let's take a look at the driver. The driver or the dominance on the DISC assessment side, they're highly assertive and low responsive. They tend to be the easiest ones to spot. We all can usually pick a driver out of the crowd pretty fast. Some of the other styles, you might have to look a little deeper. And the reason is they tend to be very quick. They're very fast, they're risk takers, they can be very forceful and dominant. They like to get things done. They typically are the person that's taking control of the room or the situation if something's going on. They value results. They're also very hardworking. They're usually putting in a lot of time and energy. On the weakness side, because they can tend to be the one to take control and want to get things done, they may lack the sensitivity to see what is going on with other folks. So they may not be tapping into other people's feelings or reactions to what's going on. They can be a little inflexible because they just want to get to that end goal. They want a bottom line. Not typically very patient. That comes up with me a lot in my secondary style, looking always typically for that quickest route. They do always want to be in control, so sometimes that can make them a little self-centered in terms of not understanding what that impact might be on other people around them. And their drive, their own mission to get somewhere can potentially hinder harmony of a group. And they tend to be a little intimidating to others. For clues, tend to be immaculate, little conservative, but very fast-paced speakers, which actually describes me. I'm working really hard today to keep my pace set. I'm getting a nod of approval from Lauren. And they do tend to have a direct stare, but they'll typically be looking over your head. And again, part of that is because they're looking for that next step where they need to be, where they're going to get to, or how they're going to get to that next place. Definitely a bottom line. Typically, they're tough negotiators, very uncompromising, and they do drive a hard bargain. They tend to, well, they don't tend to, they want to win. They always want to win. They don't necessarily want to be your friend, but they want to win. So let's take a look next at the amiable. The amiable on the DISC assessment side is steadiness. That's a highly responsive, but low assertiveness on the chart. They're very good listeners. They're very warm, friendly, agreeable, supportive, tend to be one of the most social of the behavioral styles. Very perceptive. They're very tuned in to the others around them and what people are thinking and feeling. And they make very loyal team members. On the weakness side, they don't typically use logic. They typically are going to come from the emotional side. So they can be poor decision makers. They're many times are going to drive their decision based on the approval that they want from others. They can be very slow to make a decision. They don't always manage time and emotions well. Again, they're very tied into what others are going to think. And it's going to be important to them what others think. So it's a high desire to please everyone else, not necessarily protecting their own interest. They are more on the casual side of appearance, very soft-spoken, slow-paced. And from an eye contact side, again, they're looking always for that connection. So they will have a warm gaze and a steady eye connection with you when you're speaking to them. The last of the four behavioral sides is the expressive. And the expressive, which is an eye on the DISC assessment, which is the influence piece, is highly assertive, highly responsive. They are persuasive, optimistic, enthusiastic. They're very spontaneous, impulsive. It tends to be the person that is going to be up on the stage. They like to be, or they're likable. They're usually very easy to be around. They're usually smiling. A lot of times, the expressive you can point out in the crowd because they're the one that's smiling. They tend to work quickly through situations and problems. On the weakness side, what that turns into, they can sometimes be too impulsive. They will typically make fairly quick decisions. Sometimes they can be snap decisions, but there's no follow-up sometimes or focus because, again, they're typically the life of the party. They're looking more for the personal connection. They don't typically like details, and can be a little undisciplined with their time and accuracy. Again, more concerned with the connection with people. You do find on the expressive and the driver side, that's actually a very high population of our realtor pool for agents that are out there. The expressives are stylish, trendy, usually speak with a little bit of drama and thoughtfulness to them, and they tend to daydream sometimes, looking out the window, not necessarily making eye contact, but they will engage with folks because they're very personable. They like to be open. They like to, you know, make sure everybody's having fun in the room. So those are all the different styles. Hopefully you've started to connect, even if you haven't gotten through the test yet, with what you probably show up as a primary and a secondary style. I'll also mention, if you prefer the DISC assessment, I know Tony Robbins has a great free assessment right on his website you can take if you would prefer a computer-driven test. On both of those, though, the big key is don't overthink it. Just answer the questions with the first thing that comes to mind, and you'll get the best assessment that way on yourself. So let's start to talk about selling to folks that are different than us, or that may show up differently in the deal to us, because it is very easy typically if you well, it will be very easy if you have a client that's the same style as you, specifically if they're the same primary and secondary style, that deal will feel very easy to both of you, because your styles will be understandable to each other. The way the data and the information is presented will be familiar and comfortable for that other person. And so those folks tend to be the easiest clients that you ever work with. But none of us wants to limit our client base to just working with folks that are exactly like us, because we're going to cross all the behavioral styles. And many times, if you're working with a couple of people buying a property, you're going to have different styles even within the same deal. Then, as realtors, we also have to sit across the table from other realtors in the deal, and so we have to understand sometimes where they're coming from to help get all this done. On page 5 of the handout, it starts to, this piece starts to talk about different strategies with the different types if you were to try to build rapport, or how to spend your time with them, and how to motivate them when they're in the middle of a transaction. So let's just take a look at a couple of these, and then we're going to dive in a little deeper into the different styles and connections. So let's look, for example, if you were working, I'm a high expressive driver. So if I'm working with an amiable, I want to understand that for them, in order to build rapport and relationship, I need to connect with them, and I need to maybe slow myself down a little bit so that we have a very harmonious, easy transaction. I might have to be a little more conscientious of how much smiling I'm doing, because they would misread potentially my seriousness of how I would show up into the situation. And they like to hear third-party stories and have guarantees and assurances along the way through the process. If you look at an analytical type, and I'm working with an analytical type, I'm going to show up to that transaction armed with data and facts and figures and analysis to explain why this is the decision that they want to try, that they potentially are going to try to make. And you're going to try to help them move along the transaction by giving them more data in the process. Now, if you have an analytical buyer, let's start with them at the top here. It's going to be very important with an analytical buyer that you're not too pushy. You want to make sure that you have action rather than words. You want to show them, you know, how you operate so that they can trust you in that transaction, not just tell them that. They're going to want details, and they're going to want specifics. They're not going to want pie in the sky numbers or estimates. They're going to want to know actual facts and numbers. The driver buyer, you're going to need to make sure that you're assertive, which might be a little uncomfortable for you, or they'll plow right through you. You want to make sure you keep to the facts. The biggest piece with the driver is to getting to the point fast. Many times when you're sitting with a driver in a meeting or trying to talk about a property, they'll look a little impatient, like you're just not getting there fast enough for them. They're very bottom line. So you want to make sure you talk about what the actions and the results are and get right to that bottom line. You also, when you're working with a driver buyer, have to understand how to say no. And they will actually appreciate that if you're upfront and honest with them, as opposed to constantly try to please. They'll look at that as being you're trying to be, phony or false, or trying to just, bowl them over with something. On the amiable buyer, you want to be friendly. You want to look for the common ground with that buyer. You want to be patient. Give them the time to actually take in the situation around them and the information that's being presented. And you want to make sure that you give them a lot of personal assurances. They want to be supported in the process. They want to know that you have their best interest at heart. For the expressive buyers, we're going to ask open-ended questions. You do need to keep pace with things. So going too slow with an expressive will typically, push them into a different mode, or maybe into their secondary mode. Make sure you're summarizing the data that as you're presenting it. So if you're giving them facts, then summarize why that's important, why you told them that information, and how that's going to help them get to their decision. And more importantly, with the expressive buyer, you want to make sure you get that commitment or buy-in as you're going through the process with them. Now, on page 6 of your handouts, there is a chart that shows for yourself, based on your style, with what you're trying to adjust to, how to modify. And again, that just ties into understanding what someone's assertiveness and responsiveness helps you adjust your own, so that if someone's low assertive and you're high assertive, you need to turn that down a little bit. You're going to have to step back, take a slower approach with that client, maybe think things through a little bit before you actually start to push them or try to push them into deals. I want to expand a little more. If you look at pages 7 and 8, one of my favorite charts, which actually it's on both pages, 7 and 8, it takes each type, and if you look at the top of that where it says like analytical on the first page, that would be the client, and then your modifications there is in the bottom part of that handout. But I want to talk a little bit or expand on some selling strategies, and it'll tie into this handout for you as you go back and take a look at this for all the different types. And this takes an approach, we just talked about from the buy side, but also from a presentation side. If you have a listing opportunity and you have folks sitting across from you, how do you show up in that listing presentation, and how do you move through your data and information? So let's start with an analytical prospect. If I'm sitting across from an analytical prospect, you want to ensure that you show up organized, graphs and charts, organize your material to show a conclusion. Now, I know some of you might be sitting there thinking, well, how do I know what my client's going to be before I show up to a listing appointment? Really, when you're putting together a listing presentation, you should incorporate components of each of these to ensure that you can meet clients where they're at when you're sitting across the table from them. But a lot of times a little research into social media, where you can actually see pictures of them and see a little bit of a picture into their life, LinkedIn, might give you some data to prep a little better before you actually meet them face to face if you've never met them. So analyticals, you want to make sure you have all those numbers put together. You're going to approach it in a very business-like fashion. You're going to get very quickly into the tasks at hand, and you want to outline a course of action for them. An analytical is going to want to know in that presentation, what are the stats? What are the figures? What's the percentage of homes in my neighborhood have sold, and what's the percentage over the asking have they gone for? They're going to want all the data to analyze in this decision. In their assessment, you're going to want to be very patient with them, but persistent. So they're not typically going to volunteer information back to you easily. So you have to be patient, let them process those numbers, and make sure you're asking a lot of questions to make sure you know where they're at in the process. You want to have a very detailed, organized presentation, and you want to make sure that there's logic and reasoning, which typically can tie into stories of why things worked in the past, or how the marketing was so effective on another listing that you did. And they're going to want that logic and reasoning to get in behind your proposal or to have buy-in into your proposal. The biggest piece with an analytical is they can be difficult to close because they're indecisive, as we were talking about. So they are going to need a lot of facts. You're going to get small commitments along the way. They're the type of person that you want to make sure that you're checking in with them on a regular basis, making sure the information's clear and that they're sort of getting closer and closer to that decision as you go through the process. If you look at that chart, again, this ties into what we've been talking about, but analytical is usually easy to spot because they'll ask a lot of why questions. They'll constantly ask why questions. They ask typically before they would tell you something. So usually it's more questions, and they tend to listen more than they talk. So again, if you're having trouble identifying someone's style, sometimes those additional clues can help you tap into that. On the driver side, when you're selling to a driver, you'll recognize them on the phone because they're going to be very quick to either try to set an appointment with you. They're going to want a quick phone call. They're not going to be looking for long stories. You can almost sense their impatience over the phone if you're talking to them on the phone. And as I mentioned earlier, they tend to be the easiest behavioral style to notice because they can be so quick and so bottom line and a little impatient. And you can read that usually a little faster than some of the other styles. The big piece, if you're working with a driver, is you want to ensure that you have a lot of visuals when you go into that presentation that summarize, bottom line it. They're not going to want the whole story leading up to why that's the price the house needs to be. They're going to want to know what is the price and give me a little data to go with that so that I can get to that same bottom line you were at. You always want to have the answer at your fingertips with a driver. In approaching them, when you walk into a home and you're going to do a listing presentation, you want to work on building the relationship, on the results, but not feelings. A driver gets very impatient with small talk. So again, if you start to talk about the weather or the kids or what's going on in the world, you'll tend to sense their impatience because they're going to want to get to the bottom line business, which is how much is my house going to sell and what are you going to do to get it sold? So get down to business quickly and allow them to talk about themselves and their situation and their desires and needs or why they're moving at that point. Typically on the assessment side, they won't sit for long. A lot of times you need to get things done with the driver while you're moving. So on a listing presentation, if I was going in and walking around the house, I would use the opportunity walking around the house with that driver to ask as many questions as possible and start to get them engaged in that process so that by the time I sat down to the table with them, I would have a better picture of where they're at and what their motivations are for that sale. They're going to want to know the bottom line first. So a driver is not going to want to hear about your company and your fabulous marketing and all the things that you've done in the past. They're going to want to know about their property. What's the bottom line, or where do you think the price is going to fall, and what are you going to do to get that property sold for them? You're going to need to be assertive and specific in your statements, and you're going to want to show results and benefits. They're going to be concerned with what have you actually done in the past and how do you get those results that you're promising. They don't want to be closed though. They pride on being really strong and fast decision makers. So don't be afraid to challenge them and try to take a little bit of control over the situation. They tend to respond very well to that. And once you have a signed contract or you've completed your business, they're going to be very quick to want you to leave. There's not going to be, like I said before, not a lot of small talk, not a lot of chit chat. It's all about bottom line. Let's get to business. Let's figure out how we can get this deal done. On the chart, if you're looking on page 7, there's a couple of pointers too, which here the big piece is how to modify your behavior if you are with a driver across the table from you or across the deal from you. Now, if you're an amiable, sometimes, again, some of these styles are more challenging that are across the line from you. If you're highly assertive and highly responsive and you're trying to communicate with someone who's low on the assertive and low on the responsiveness, those tend to be the bigger challenges because, you're the furthest apart really from style piece. So understanding how you might need to, your natural style may be to be friendly and open and warm and want to have a conversation and connect with them and talk about their kids' soccer team. And when you're sitting across from that driver, you're going to need to show up very businesslike, very matter of fact, bottom line it, use a firm handshake, sort of show them that that's okay, that their style's okay, and that you can get the deal done for them based on how they're going to show up in the transaction. The next one would be the amiable and selling strategies for the amiable. If you look on page 8 of the handout, you want to keep, for the amiable prospects, you want to keep the conversation and the visit very informal and chatty. So again, just like I was talking about the amiable showing up for the driver, when a driver shows up for an amiable, they got to take it down a notch because they don't like to tend to have chit chat and talk about the weather and the kids. And an amiable is looking for that because that's how they trust and connect with folks. So you want to prepare yourself by learning about their personal interest in their situation. Again, sometimes through social media or through their LinkedIn pages or through other connections to find out what might be of interest to them. They're going to want to know that you have connections to them maybe outside of the business world. Your approach is going to have to be more friendly, more informal. You're going to listen and let them talk about their family, let them talk freely about the situation. Again, when you go across the chart from this, the driver, that's the hardest thing for the driver to do. You got to kind of take that deep breath and sit back in the chair and let them get there. They're going to ask more how questions. And they're definitely, they definitely talk on a slower pace. So that's where when the driver shows up, if you look at the modifications to your behavior, the driver needs to listen more, talk less, which is not part of their natural style, not rush the process, and speak and move a lot slower, very conscientiously. Really think about that in terms of how you present. The amiable will tend to wander off topic easier. Again, can be a little frustrating for some of the styles, but so you have to show up and you have to be the balance. You have to help keep the conversation on topic while still connecting with them and understanding, a lot of times when they're sharing about their family and their situation, they're actually giving you really good information on what's motivating them for that sale. And so that helps us show up where they're at and help them show how they're going to get what they're really looking for. You want to make sure that in a presentation to an amiable, you show them how what you're going to do for them will impact others positively. So third-party testimonials go a long way with these folks, but they're very concerned with others and what's going to happen to others and what's going to happen in the family environment. So I'll give you an example with an amiable. If you were doing a listing presentation, you might tell them that, you're very concerned with how people are going to come in their home and how appointments are set, and you'll be very careful to ensure that appointments are set in a timely manner that gives them enough notice for them and their family so that they can accommodate. Those are the types of things they're going to be a little more concerned with in terms of their world in the transaction. The amiables, when you're looking for that commitment from them, they will make a decision, but a lot of times they're the ones in the deals that will have buyer's remorse and or cancel. So you might be able to get them to that decision faster, but you have to watch for you have to watch for any concerns that they may have that they're not raising. And part of the reason why they're not raising those concerns is because they really like people. They want people to really like them, and they don't want to cause conflict. So if they have concerns while you're talking to them in a presentation about something, they may not raise that. At that point, you have to kind of watch for that and try to help them bring that up. That would help eliminate some of that buyer's remorse that might come after the fact. So drawing out as many of the concerns and or disagreements that might be put on the table would really help keep a deal together for an amiable as you go forward and or keep the contract together. The last one I want to take a look at is the expressive. If you look at the bottom of page 8, the expressive or the influence folks, they're okay actually if you make an unannounced visit or phone call. That's fine with them because they are more impulsive. You do want to understand what the expressive's ambitions are and what their personal, I'll call it the ego, if you will, what their personal ego is. They like to be front and center. They like to be the life of the party. They tend to be the person that's socializing with everybody. If you walked in a room, they don't have any issue walking in a room and getting to know everybody. So with an approach for them, you do want to combine small talk with business. So this is more of a little bit of a combination. They want to know that you understand them and where they come from, and that you also understand what they're bringing into the table for the transaction, what they're putting on the table for the transaction. They'll want to be, and I'll put this in air quotes here through the webinar, on stage. So they're the most important piece of this process, but they'll need time to vent their strong opinions about the issues. So be a good listener. One of the biggest mistakes I see realtors make with an expressive is the expressive will be talking through a situation and the realtor will misinterpret that. So the expressive will be saying things like, oh, when we did the home inspection, so there was a problem with the furnace and there's a little issue with the electrical panel. And sometimes an agent will take that as, oh, this person doesn't want this house. They think there's too many issues. And all the expressive's actually really doing is talking through the issues so that they can get to the conclusion. So don't assume, ask more questions, dig a little bit deeper, but let them actually talk through the process, because that helps them get to a decision that tends to stick a little better and it can be a little bit stronger. They do desire to be different, and they will typically freely express their wants and needs, so they're the easiest style to get information from in terms of what they want to do for the listing or what's going to be the most important to them. They're going to want to know how you're going to make their life easier in the process. So addressing the marketing and how fast you're going to get the property under contract and how everybody's going to love their property is going to be important to them. They are going to demand personal service from you. So don't be fooled into the lightheartedness of the transaction. They tend to be very serious from the customer service side. They also tend to be the first to complain about poor customer service or bad follow-up. So they are going to require a lot of attention throughout the transaction to make sure that they feel like they're being heard and understood, and that you're really giving them that white glove service. When you're doing a presentation with the expressive, make sure that you begin with an overview. Express what is different and unique about you and your company. They will really appreciate that uniqueness. You want to stress the future benefits and how you're going to make their life easy in this process, and recognize that they can be very quick and impulsive. So they will potentially make a decision very fast, and make sure you have that contract ready to go. They definitely are the behavioral style where you want to use an assumptive close. All the way through the presentation, you need to be acting as if this is your listing and you're already taking care of them and just identifying that or relaying that to them. And so that contract needs to be ready to go by your side, because if you're doing that assumptive close correctly, they typically will sign long before you think they're ready to sign that paperwork. So this has been a lot of information today. The last page of the handout that I'll point out is what we looked at when we looked at the different styles, the clues. So that's a nice chart to kind of look at as you're assessing your clients, whether it's on the buy or the sell side. I challenge you, once you figure out your style, and this is always a fun exercise to do, go back into your client database and start to figure out their behavioral style. And a lot of times the miscommunications or the challenges we've had with them could have potentially been avoided if we had understood where they were coming from and how they were showing up. And many times you actually, when deals fall apart or we're unable to close people, if we look at those behavioral styles, you could up that conversion rate by understanding, how they were coming to the table, and hopefully close more deals as the year goes on and into 2020. So thanks for joining me today. I think we're going to pull Lauren into this and see if there's any questions.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Paula. If you have any questions, now's the time to write them in your chat box. If you'd like to learn more about any of the personalities, if you had any questions about the characteristics or understanding how to understand your clients a little bit better, go ahead and write them in your chat box. It looks like we don't have any questions right now, so I'll just give it a moment.
So what do you think you are, Lauren, based on what we just talked about?
I know. I was thinking, I think I'm an analyzer. I analyze everything.
You get some amiable in there, though. So amiable's on the, yeah.
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 That's funny.
But very analytical, very detail oriented,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I love personalities and learning more about the DISC personalities too. It's all really good information. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions. I guess everybody has the handouts, and it's. I'll give you a couple minutes to wrap up here if you want to, Paula.
Great. Well, I appreciate everybody joining us this morning and/or coming to us on the recording. I've got my cell phone number and email up on the screen. Happy to answer any questions around this topic if you ever want to connect and talk a little more about that, or some help with your own personality style and what that means to you. And again, remember, there's really not a right or a wrong here. I know a lot of times when I'm coaching folks around this, they especially when we're drivers, we tend to think that that might be too assertive, or some of the styles, or they feel like maybe they're too meek with some of the styles. There's not a right or a wrong. And the better you understand your style and how other folks are naturally showing up, the easier communication is, the easier the relationship is, the easier the deal can be.
Great. Okay, that looks like that's, nobody has any questions. So as a reminder to everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be available to view in the next few days on our website at marealtor.com. If you're going through any of the handouts and you need to, look back at the video, that'll be available to you. Thank you so much, Paula, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for joining today. We hope to see you next time.